Hello, student geographers. This is Miss Wiley. I will be doing the video lecture over Chapter 5, which is about identity, our race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. The first part of the chapter talks about how we identify ourselves and the ways in which we construct our identities. Jillian Rose is the geographer connected with the idea of identity and how we make sense of ourselves. She said that we essentially establish these identities through our emotions, our experiences, both the connections and the rejections, that identities are fluid, constantly changing, shifting, becoming, and they can vary across scales, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Specifically, one way we identify ourselves is to identify against, meaning we are not that. And the example in the book is talked about with Europeans who identified the colonies the areas they colonized as being mystical or savage, and then they define themselves as not mystical or savage, like civilized versus non-civilized, and that was identifying against. Gender is another way we identify ourselves. Gender is based on a culture's assumptions about the differences between men and women, what they should do, how they should work. Dimash and Seeger are the two geographers connected with gender. Societies tend to be most gendered in terms of divisions of labor. And the example in the textbook is with the brickmakers in Bali. They are women and boys, whereas in the U.S. it's men who use machines. And society is told the people of Bali that women and children should be the ones to make the bricks, but in the U.S. it's the men that should be making bricks. Race is again another way we identify ourselves. Race has to do with the our categorization of skin color, our physical characteristics. Specifically, skin color relates to the amount of melanin in our skin. So you can be anywhere in the spectrum of white to black, and that is your race. Racial distinctions are rooted in cultural history, power relationships, and politics. And Benjamin Forrest is credited by talking about the differences between cultures and history and how they explain racial identity. So for example, in Britain, black equals African. In Russia, black actually equals Caucasians or Chechens, the people of the Caucasus Mountains. In Brazil, white includes upper class, mixed is middle class, and black is lower class. So those are just some different distinctions we use for race. In terms of racism, which is sort of the superiority of one race over others, Benedict Anderson talks about this being more about socioeconomic classes fueling racism rather than it just strictly being about race. So he talks about the importance of economic decisions and who makes more money, and that creates more of those racial tensions between groups. This is a map of the race for the United States based on the 2000 census. And again, what you can tell from this map is that there are certainly some classifications that are not race, like American Indian or Asian and Pacific Islander. Those are not races. Those are more ethnicities, yet they are put on our racial categories for the census. And then this is a projection graph, and it is shows the population by ethnicity from 2000 to 2050. And what's interesting is that by 2050, the white non-Hispanic population will no longer be the majority. The all other groupings will surpass them. In terms of residential segregation, this is when two or more groups live separately from each other in different parts of an urban environment. And that definition is from Massey and Denton. They have 5 measurements of residential segregation: evenness, exposure, concentration, centralized, and clustered. And those are how they assess whether a city is more segregated or less segregated. It is illegal to legislate residential segregation, yet it still exists, usually because people want to live near people of the same ethnicity or race. In terms of areas of highest and lowest residential segregation, for African Americans, the areas with the highest rates are Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Detroit, Michigan. And the cities with the lowest rate for African Americans is Orange County, California, and San Jose, California. In terms of Hispanics and Latinos, Baltimore is the least. New York City is the most. In terms of Asian Pacific Islanders, Baltimore is the least again, yet San Francisco and New York City are also most segregated for Asians. The next part of the chapter talks about identities across scales, and those can be the local scale, regional scale, national scale, or global scale. And these are some examples of how we can identify ourselves at a local scale versus regional versus national versus global. All of these are fluid, intertwined, they affect each other, and we just use our different identities based on what context we need to use them for. So for example, if you say you are a Peachtree Ridge student, that's a local scale identity. You're not going to go to another country like China and talk about being a Peachtree Ridge student. You would go and use your national identity as being an American, or maybe even your global identity of being wealthy or Western. So you use your different identities across scales based on the context in which they need to be used. In terms of neighborhoods, these also have sort of identities that we put on them. And when a certain ethnic group moves into an area of the city and takes over, that's called invasion and succession. We can see the evidence of these different groups by the term sequent occupants, where you can have, for example, in Washington Heights, which is I think what this picture is of, you may have the Dominican Republic flag, but you may also have parts of the Jewish culture that were present before the Dominicans came into the region. That's sequent occupants. 65% of Hispanics in New York City are from the Caribbean, not from Mexico, not from South America, but from the Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. And Enos Miaris wrote a book called The Changing Latinization of New York City, and in it they discuss the invasion of succession of East Harlem by the Puerto Ricans, now called Spanish Harlem or El Barrio, and the Dominicans invading and succeeding Washington Heights, which was traditionally Jewish, African American, Puerto Rican, and Cuban. And those are sort of two examples of New York City in terms of its Hispanic identity. What is interesting is that more Mexican immigrants are coming into New York City now. But at this point, we still have a huge Hispanic population from Puerto Rico and Dominican as well. How do places affect identity, and how can we see identities in places? So Jillian Rose, once again, is the geographer that talks about identity, and she also talks about something called sense of place, which is how we infuse places with meaning and feeling, with memories and emotions, and we get a feeling about a place based on those. So in terms of the emotions that you have with a place is going to be part of your sense of place. Ethnicity, unlike race is based on skin color. Ethnicity is based on your family history, your identity based on your cultural history that your people share, that your family shares. And so ethnocentrism would be people that view one's ethnicity as being superior to others. Somewhat like racism is one race superior to others, ethnocentrism is one's ethnicity is superior to others. So in terms of how places create identities, the example in the book is between the Swiss Americans versus people of Switzerland. And people that are Swiss Americans identify themselves differently from people of Switzerland. People of Switzerland would be very much call themselves, identify themselves based on the language and maybe even the dialect of that language that they speak within Switzerland. Whereas a Swiss American is going to identify themselves as being just from Switzerland and from America together. And I believe the other example in the book with this is also between India and Pakistan. And in those two countries, you would have people, again, identify themselves very much at a local level, local scale. But if they, once they move to the United States, for example, they identify themselves much more on a regional or even global scale as being from South Asia. And this is another area or another example of identities and how they leave their mark on places. In Mexicali, which is on the Mexico-California border, but it is in Mexico, there is a Chinatown from 1800s. When the Chinese came to build railroads, they established themselves firmly in Mexicali and in turn built structures that were very much about their Chinese heritage. You'll see from the map Chinese laundry, Chinese bunkhouse, Chinese compound, Chinese shacks. And as although Mexicali's Chinatown, the Chinese residents are moving away, their mark is still left, and you still see that mark within the landscape. So back to sense of place. One of the things that is confusing, I think, about the chapter is the difference between space and place, and I think it's mostly that the definitions in the book are just unclear. But when you think about space, I want you to think about activity space. It's just what are we engaged in that area? That's our space. But when we start having relationships, connections, emotions that are put on that space, it becomes more of a place, and we have a strong sense of place as a result of it. And so when people make places, they do so in the context of the surrounding social relationships of that they associate with that space. And this kind of moves us into the idea of all sorts of groups. When people share a common identity, and it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could even be gender, they establish places or have a sense of place about places that they share with others that they identify with. So there are certain gendered places that are designed for women and for men. And this maps somewhat gets put with the idea of homosexuality or sexual orientation, because it's showing the same-sex households in New York. But just keep in mind that whenever you look at this map, it does not necessarily tell you how many homosexuals live there. Because in New York City, you oftentimes have people that live together and maybe living together with someone of the same gender, yet they're not homosexuals. They just need to share a space, share the expenses of a place, since New York City is so expensive. And you also may not be able to see a true telling of where homosexuals live within New York City, because if they live alone, they would not be put on this map either. And the queer theory is one idea associated with sexuality, in the sense that oftentimes theories in the past or ideas of why humans do what they do have only been based on the heteronormative, which is the heterosexual white male. And Elder, Knopp, and Nast are the theorists that say we need to look at the other groups. We need to look at women, we need to look at blacks and Hispanics and Asians, and we need to look at homosexuals. And so the word queer is used as what is not normal, and in this case heteronormative, which is the heterosexual white male. And the last part of the chapter deals with power relationships and how they subjugate certain groups of people. And a power relationship is just a relationship that exists where one person or one group has more power over another. And we see that evident on the landscape as well. The big example that we talked about and was in the book is Belfast, Northern Ireland, where you have a power relationship that exists between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants hold more power since they are the same religion of England, which controls Northern Ireland. And the hatred and fighting between these two groups is evident on the landscape in terms of these peace walls and murals that are put up on the buildings that you can tell which kind of neighborhood you're in, whether it's Protestant or Catholic. You can see the battles that have been fought, and even images of people that have been killed in these battles. And that clearly shows you that power relationship that exists. Oftentimes, power relationships affect people in terms of how they're counted, like the U.S. Census might undercount minority populations, or the homeless may not even be counted, in which case there may be more of a power relationship of wealthy over the poor, or majority over the minority. Oftentimes, in terms of the rich over the poor, gross national income comes into play because it only counts the formal economy, and so women who work from home or people that do odds and ends jobs out of their house but may not have a standard paycheck, that's all part of the informal economy and is not part of the GNI. There may be more of a social stigma against people that don't have a formal paycheck, because of that, because of the economic difference there. Here's another example of informal economy. Okay, it's okay.